Hey everybody, in continuation to our previous video, the previous tutorial for downward facing dog, which had an emphasis for shoulder flexion and the placement of the arms and the shoulder in downward dog, we're gonna take another element of the downward dog, and this is the spine. Probably I mentioned it in the previous video, I don't remember. But for me, the first thing for downward dog is to find that spinal axial extension, so into your axis without going into a hyperextension or a back bend, and coming out of this curled spine. Now, in order to be able to find that pelvic position that would allow us to have the spine nice and long, we also need to have good space on our hamstrings so that we are able to keep our hamstrings nice and long. But if this is not the case, we can always modify by bending the knees, especially if there's any injury or any inflammation in the attachment to the sit bone that might create discomfort when the pelvis goes towards a more anterior position. And the degrees of the anterior position might vary that stimulate pain and discomfort. We don't want to be in discomfort or pain. So if there's a current situation for a tendinopathy, what we call yoga bad, you can modify by bending the knees. I know some teachers propose to keep your pelvis more rounded in a more posterior tilt, but that would also affect the elongation of your spine. So I try to steer away from that, bringing us into a more neutral pelvis, really, and feeling that elongation from there. We don't want to go overboard and spill the pelvis forward. Especially if you're on the flexible spectrum, we want to maintain that integrity and create much more control into our pose. And so beginning with a little bit of an awareness movement, you can bring your hand on the floor, and I'm assuming that you've warmed up your wrists. We've done the shoulder blade warm up and the glenohumeral as well, since we're going into downward dog. All of these were in the previous video. So if you come on all fours, pressing the floor away and find your axial extension, feeling your sit bones reach back, the crown of the head reaching forward. And notice if you can feel the elongation both in your spine, in the sides of your waist. We try not to let the head collapse and drop, but neither lifting our chin up. And then you can tuck your toes, and by pushing your hands forward, shift the hips back. So we're moving into more hip flexion. And for some people, if we have limitation in the hips, we might begin to round the spine, which is something we want to steer away from. Not that it's a bad thing, but for this case, we want to keep the pelvis in neutral. So the hands push forward, we're moving back. Begin to also push your toes into the floor so that we can warm up a little bit the feet as well. And then forward. Moving towards our hip flexion, keeping the spine nice and long, and at the same time still thinking of that axial extension, elongating the spine. Back, and return to a quadruped position. Now you can point the toes if you want to, and just let the pelvis tilt posteriorly and then anteriorly. So we're going into our retroversion and our anteversion. Tucking and untucking if you have it, and try to maintain control of your shoulder blades, your scapula. The dorsal part of the spine, meaning the thoracic spine, stays stable, and we're just mobilizing pelvis. Of course, the lower back, the lumbar will follow. And eventually, we want to articulate the spine, moving one vertebrae at a time, coming into a full flexion, and then into a full extension. And here I'm not just warming up the spine tissues and the torso, but I'm also bringing awareness and proprioception as to what the range of motion is in my pelvis, in my spine, how the body is feeling at this moment. If there's anything that is feeling tight, and how much control I actually have in moving my spine. Right. So coming into a neutral position, and for the first downward dog, let's take our blocks, put them on the lower setting, and coming back to a little summary from our previous video. You're pushing your hands forward, you keep the chest lifted and the collarbones broad, the neck is long, and we shift back and we slowly lift up, and we continue to reach the arms forward. Here my blocks are a little slippery, so I'm going to bring them to the edge of the block so that I don't have to grab my blocks. And the shoulders are pushing towards the floor. The spine is nice and long. And here, check if you can tuck and untuck your pelvis. I'm just going to change the position on the mat so that you can maybe see a little better. And I still have my knees bent here so that I can actually move my pelvis. I'm tucking and I'm tucking, untucking. And just notice, can you actually do that? Or is it very easy to tuck, but not so easy to untuck, to let the pelvis go anterior to the front? Or maybe as you take the pelvis anterior, you feel that your hamstrings are pulling so much that you cannot take it any further. Or you might even feel your lower back beginning to contract. Now, we want to be in a neutral pelvis, so come and find that position that you feel the pelvis is neutral. And what helps me find that is to think that my pubic bone is lengthening towards the back, but my tail is at the same time heavy, so that I'm not overdoing it. Now, I'm one of those people that it's very easy for me to have my pelvis tucked and not so easy to have it beyond neutral. Yeah. So thinking that elongation from the pubic bone helps me to maintain that pelvic position. For some others of you that might be more on the other side of the spectrum, you might need to think the tail being much heavier towards the floor. Now, I'm not sinking into my shoulders are still strong, and I'm really sending my hips back, lengthening my entire spine using the downward dog for an axial extension. Now, if your hamstrings are tight, you could always bend your knees, but keep that sense of the heels pushing in towards the floor. And in time, maybe they start to stretch a little more, but the legs stay active. Now, if you're flexible enough and you see one block has moved forward. So if you're flexible enough and you find that your heels are easily on the ground, try not to let just your knees push back without any muscular control. Now, I don't really like to say to lift your kneecaps up or to engage your quads, because it's not just a topical action, it's the entire chain that activates. So as you push your heels down towards the floor and back, you help engage the entire leg without thinking that, oh, I have to lift my kneecaps or I have to contract my abs, which might bring more attention to the body. So if we take the blocks away and we try to come into a downward dog, once again, I always like to prepare by feeling my hands, feeling my arms, and I have quite hyper extended joints, if we can say that. And so I try to maintain that strength and support of my joints. So they might look that they're locking, but they're really not. There's still that space in my joints, and the muscles are supporting the joints well. So I'm really pushing. I'm already thinking the pubic bone back, the tail is heavy, lifting the pelvis. And here I just shift a little bit from one side to the other. And keep both knees bent for a moment until you really feel your pelvis and your spine, noticing the elongation on your waist, maybe the front of the belly, maybe your spine, kind of what you felt before where we were on the quadruped position and we were trying to elongate the spine. And begin by pushing your right heel down to the floor, stretching the leg, the left stays bent, and then change. Push the other heel down and then bend the other knee, but you're doing it so slowly and mindfully. The toes are spreading, they push, and the heel is pushing down as if you're pushing into a spring or something heavy, that you're crushing it on the floor. So notice how the front of the leg is feeling as well, not just the stretch at the back of the leg. And then bring the heels towards the floor, pressing the heels down and back, and notice what that does to your legs. And we want to have that balanced co-contraction between the back and the front. And then walk your hands back until you bring your heels on the floor. And here, once again, if the legs are tight, the hamstrings, the back of the legs, you might want to bend your knees a little bit. And we don't want to be relying on just the joint locking without engaging the muscles. So back off if you don't have that strength. And lengthen your spine. And see if you can keep your spine long, bringing your hands onto your hips, pushing your hips back, and keep lengthening forward, trying to find a straight spine like in your downward facing dog, keeping a little bit more weight into your toes. Again, that co-contraction in your legs remains, and the neck is nice and long. Might feel it's a lot of work for your legs, and it's true. You might even feel the abs working to support your position. If you're prone to rounding your spine, try to bend the knees and move your pubic bone back. Keep your knees bent if you need to. If you're over flexible and you have the tendency to go the other way, I cannot even do it. Try to find that support at the front of your rib cage, and then thinking of the crown of the head lengthening forward. And so here we're also strengthening isometrically our hamstrings. And let's come down, walk your hands forward once again. Finding your downward dog. And now that we stay there for a moment, standing in a slightly more than halfway bent position, you might feel your legs have a little bit more space. And lift your heels up and bring your knees down. Good. And so shoulders is one element that we explored in an earlier video. Here we're exploring the spine and also the position of the pelvis. Yeah, you might have noticed that the capacity to hinge the pelvis affects our hamstrings. And if we're really hinging from the hips, bending from the hips, as the pelvis is moving, of course, the hamstrings are stretching. Yeah. And so if you have an injury or if it pulls a lot on your hamstrings, then we might need to consider doing something else to strengthen those tendons and those ligaments, your hamstrings as well, in a lengthened position, so that we can come out of the phase of inflammation. And so if you are having difficulty pivoting from the pelvis and you're always kind of going down with a rounded pelvis, I would suggest that you bend your knees and you start to hinge, trying to keep the lower back nice and long, and then come back up. Folding and coming back up, just to become more aware and have a better proprioception as what it means to move from the hips. Now, it's the same thing we did here, that hinging, but of course here your hamstrings are out of the way, yeah, because you're on your knees. And so this is another exercise to learn to find that hinge, but because your hands and your knees are on the floor, it might be more difficult, especially if you have limited hip flexion. Yeah, it might be more difficult to maintain the pelvis neutral. So try both, see how your body feels. And if you have any questions or if you're feeling any limitations in the way that you're practicing. And you could even video yourself and then have a look and see, is my spine straight? Is my spine rounded? Are my shoulders collapsing? Checking out these things. And in another video, we can talk about the hamstrings, what we can do to help to be able to release them so that they can find their full length without feeling pain. And possibly in another video, addressing pain and hamstring, proximal hamstring tendinopathy, yeah, which is very common for people who stretch a lot or do yoga, and it shouldn't be really. So thank you very much for watching. See you soon.